lead for the primary care school within the east of England. I was previously a deputy co-chair of the Health Education England Heroes Network, which was the HEE Rainbow organisation. And I am coming at this from an ally's perspective, and I am joined today by Thor, who is going to go through their lived experience a bit later. So I don't know if Thor, you want to jump in now and just say hello?
Hello, hello.
Thank you very much. Okay, so hopefully you're all here for a pronouns and acronyms session. Firstly, we are going to cover what pronouns are, a bit about the acronym, and then we're going to do a bit of interactivity, which I'm sure you're all used to by now, just using Slido. So a little bit of a quiz just to test your knowledge. So first up, what do we mean when we talk about pronouns, common pronouns and other common terms? And then there's a short animation, and actually I've just remembered I'll need to stop sharing my slides and reshare to optimize for sound when we get to that point. And then we'll just go through the quiz, and then we can have a round of questions if it's helpful. So pronouns are the words we use to refer to people when we're not talking directly to them, and often they have gendered implications. And in English, I'm sure you all know, the most commonly used pronouns are undoubtedly he or she. So my pronouns are she, which would be a reasonably safe assumption, but obviously for some people, you just can't assume. So they obviously refer specifically to a person's gender. However, for queer or gender non-conforming, non-binary and transgender people, those pronouns may not fit. And I also really just want to take this opportunity to talk about the term preferred. So you might see in people's email signatures and things like that that they say preferred pronouns, or refer to it as preferred pronouns. But for most people, it's not actually a preference. It's actually just a choice, or it's who they are. So we should stop referring to them as preferred pronouns and just reference them as pronouns. I hope that makes sense. So for most people who don't necessarily understand the kind of context around this, they will suggest that you can't use a plural pronoun to refer to a singular person, but of course you can. So obviously we have he and him, as I've already mentioned, which is a gender specific pronoun usually used to refer to men or boys. We have she and her, again a gender specific pronoun usually used to refer to women or girls, and then they or them, which are gender neutral pronouns typically used to refer to people you don't know. And you can also use sie and them and many other variations. So it's good practice to be familiar with words that are commonly used when we talk about the LGBTQIA+ community, as well as gender experience and identity. And obviously be aware that even though someone may fit the generally used definition of one of those terms, they may not necessarily personally identify that way. And obviously, again, they don't have to, but it's always best to ask, to listen, and then to actually refer to a person in the way that they have asked you to refer to them. And you can also still use a person's name. I think we forget that. So if you really aren't sure, you don't feel it's the right environment to ask, just call them Becca or whatever their name is. Some people don't actually want to use pronouns at all, and so therefore they may generally ask you to refer them by name alone. So next up, we're going to have a look at some of the common terms. As I mentioned, it's obviously good practice to be familiar with words that are commonly used when we talk about the LGBTQIA+ community. So first up is sex. Now, sex is a label, and there are three that fall into this category. So we have male, female, or intersex. And unless you have specific issue with adolescence or puberty that lead to a chromosome test, sex is usually entirely decided by genitals. But in fact, there are actually 5 things that define this, including chromosomes, but they're not necessarily how a person identifies. So does anybody know what those 5 things are? Shout them out at me, because I can't see any hands. And if you don't know, say you don't know.
Don't know.
Excellent. That's why you're here. So as I mentioned, we've got chromosomes being one of them, gonads, hormones, the internal reproductive anatomy, and also the external genitalia. So obviously a baby is born, a doctor will look at them, look at their external genitalia and say, right, that baby is male or female. But we know it's not really as simple as that. Next up is gender, which is really quite complex. So that in itself is a social and legal status, as well as a set of expectations from society about behaviours, characteristics and thoughts. Now, gender identity is that internal perception of one's gender and how they label themselves based on how much they align or don't align with what they understand their options for gender to be. And then we move on to cis or cisgender, which typically applies to someone whose gender matches their assigned sex at birth. Trans or transgender applies to a person whose gender is different from their assigned sex at birth. And again, doctors typically assign gender based on those visible sexual organs, but sex and gender are very much different. Non-binary is a spectrum of gender identities that are not exclusively masculine or exclusively feminine, and identities that are outside of the gender binary of male and female. The term genderqueer is actually similar to non-binary in some respects, but it has a slightly different meaning. So the dictionary defines genderqueer as denoting or relating to a person who does not subscribe to conventional gender distinctions, but identifies with neither, both, or a combination of male and female genders. So non-binary and genderqueer are often used interchangeably by some people, but not everyone considers them the same thing, and others consider the term genderqueer as an umbrella term to cover an identity that isn't cisgender. And some people obviously regard the word queer as offensive, whilst others embrace it. Gender fluid or gender fluidity applies to a person whose gender identity changes over time or changes at different times, depending on various external factors. And sexual orientation is an emotional, romantic, or sexual attraction to other people of either the same gender, a different gender, or multiple genders. Any questions so far? I shall take silence as a no. Thank you. So for many people, their gender identity corresponds to the sex they were registered at birth, and for others it doesn't. Some people see gender identity as more of a spectrum rather than a binary, as we've already talked about. So this is where I need to stop sharing my screen and reshare with sound. So please do just bear with me a second. Oh no. It's not working. I should have checked this before. It's a great resource, this this video. What I'll do is I will find the link not embedded within this e-learning module. I have to say I haven't actually updated my slides recently, but about a year ago, myself and a number of colleagues created an ELFH learning hub module, which got great feedback from those that were don't know how to word this. those that were interested, and those that are perhaps not so interested and see it as more woke without really understanding the word woke, had some feedback on it. So unfortunately we were actually forced to take the learning module down for the time being, but hopefully that will be back shortly. So as soon as it is, I'll let everybody know. And as I say, I'll find the animation itself that isn't embedded and share that so that you can all watch that in your own time. But it just sort of deconstructs the acronym and talks a bit more about some of those terms that I've already mentioned, and yeah, other things really, other scenarios. And it's just a great piece of work, even if I do say so myself. So apologies about that. I shall reshare. Oh, I'll just check the chat while I'm here. I for ages didn't realise it was based on 5 things, but there you go. Now you know, something you can take away from this session, hopefully. So, just going to share that again. Okay. So moving on to the next slide. This is where we start our Slido journey. So if you could all either scan the QR code, I know that the colours aren't great, but it's in that circle on the bottom right hand side of the screen, or just go to slido.com and then join using hashtag 102507. Sorry, Thor, how many people have we got here? Just so I know how many more I'm waiting for.
I'm seeing 16, including yourself.
Excellent. Thank you. I just don't want to inadvertently jump ahead. I like to do everything at 100 miles an hour, so this really tests my patience sometimes. Give it a little while longer. Okay, maybe some people have stepped away from their desks, so we will start and hopefully they can join in as they come back, or whatever. And if you're struggling with Slido, then play along, just not digitally. It's just a bit of fun. So first up, how many LGBTQ flags are there? Just waiting on one more response. Okay, I'm going to move it on. So the majority of you went with small 13. However, I can confirm there are in fact 188 LGBTQIA plus flags. There's a really helpful document actually on this from, I want to say, the Leicester Fire Service, but I can dig that out again and circulate that with these slides. So moving on to our next question. How many categories of LGBTQIA plus flags do we think there are? Between 1 and 5 or more. Excellent. Thank you, everyone. The answer is 4. So with that many, you would be right to assume that there is more than 5 categories, but there isn't. And again, it's all outlined in that document that I'll circulate for you. So you can do some light bedtime reading. So I forgot to say, actually, this next exercise is pen and paper. So hopefully you've all got pen and paper to hand. And this is what I like to call a game of match the flags. So there's 2 rounds of this. So which flag, going from left to right on the pictures, do you think matches description 1? 3 coloured stripes to represent polysexuality. Number 2, the more colour, more pride, to include people of colour who are often excluded from the LGBTQ plus community. Number 3, 3 stripes to represent gender queer. Number 4, 3 stripes to represent pansexuality. Number 5, the original Rainbow Pride flag designed by Gilbert Baker in 1978, which consists of 8 coloured stripes, each with a different meaning. And number 6, the straight ally flag, celebrating all straight and cisgender people who are proud allies of the LGBTQIA plus community. So we're going to mark those now. So flag number 1, statement number 1 matches flag number 5. So that's 3 coloured stripes to represent polysexuality. Next up, we have statement number 2, which goes with flag number 3, which is the more colour, more pride flag. Statement 3 matches flag 4, so 3 stripes that represent gender queer. Statement 4 is flag number 2, 3 coloured stripes to represent pansexuality. Statement 5, our original Rainbow Pride flag matches flag number 1. And finally, statement 6, our straight ally flag matches flag number 6. Anyone fancy shouting out how many of those they got correct?
I got all but one.
Excellent.
It was the polysexuality and genderqueer that I mixed up.
Ah, well, good job anyway. We're all here to learn, aren't we? We can't know everything as human beings. So another round of match the flags. Flag statement 1, primarily homosexual, but with a limited amount of attraction to the opposite sex or willingness to take part in a heterosexual activity. So again, left to right on the flags and then top to bottom. Lisa, are you okay to mute yourself? Because I think that's background noise. Thank you.
Sorry, I was going to ask you to repeat
go on.
the representations to match the flags, but
On the last slide.
yeah, sorry.
No, you're fine. I can go back to that. No problem at all. So it's flag 1. Oh, I keep doing that. Sorry, it's Friday. Statement 1, flag 5. So 3 coloured stripes to represent polysexuality. Statement 2 is flag 3, so this one here. To match more colour, more pride. Flag 3 goes with statement 2, as I just said. Sorry, I'm losing the will to live right now. I don't know why. Sorry, so statement 3, 3 stripes represent gender queer, and that is flag 4, this one. Are you following along?
Oh, sorry,
No, I'm not
Becca.
making it
We
easier
can't
for
see
you.
your cursor, so you may want to describe the flag that
Oh,
you're
can't you?
talking about.
Okay, fine. That makes more sense then. So we've got that was number 3, and we're looking at flag 4, so purple, white, and green stripe. And then we've got statement 4, which goes with flag number 2, which is our pink, yellow, and blue stripe for pansexuality. Statement 5 goes with flag number 1, so the very first flag, which was, of course, the very first flag created back in 1978. So that's our 8 coloured stripes of the rainbow. And then we've got our number 6, which is the black and white stripes with the rainbow triangular shape in the middle. So that's the straight ally flag.
That was the only one I got correct.
Oh, well, well done. Well done for getting 1 correct. And apologies for my difficulties in getting my phrases out there. But hopefully you're following along now. So let's move on to number 2. So the first statement is the primarily homosexual, but with a limited amount of attraction to the opposite sex or willingness to take part in a heterosexual activity flag. Which flag do we think that is? Next up, we've got someone who is asexual and repulsed by sex. So sex repulsed. Which flag do we think that is? Number 3, a subsection of gender fluid, where one feels as though their gender identity fluctuates between parts or different gender identities. Excuse me. Statement 4, which flag represents a person that feels like they're perhaps half one gender and half another? Statement 5, a person who does not feel sexual attraction until there's a strong emotional bond formed. And finally, number 6, believing your gender identity is determined by environmental and or external factors. So like I mentioned earlier, and that may include the time of the day, the weather, whether it's winter, spring, summer, and also the people around you. I'm going to move on to the answers for that one now. So first up, we have statement 1 with flag 2, which is apothesexual. So primarily homosexual, but there's a limited amount of attraction to opposite sex, and people are willing at times to take part in heterosexual activity. Statement number 2, someone who is asexual and repulsed by sex matches flag number 5. So we've got the blue, white, red, purple and pink flag, and that represents demisexuality. Number 3 goes with flag number 1, so the one with the big cross in the middle, which is the subsection of gender fluid, where one feels as though their gender identity fluctuates between parts or different gender identities, and that's what we call homoflexible. Statement 4, which is aerogender, matches flag 6, so the yellow, cream, grey colours in the bottom there. Statement 5 goes with flag 3, so the rainbow with the grey stripe down the middle, which is a person who feels no sexual attraction until a strong emotional bond has been formed, and that's what we call Christogender. And then finally we have statement 6, which is believing your gender identity is determined by environmental and or external factors, and that's flag number 4. So the blues, pinks and yellows, and that represents hemigender. Obviously, this is just a very, very small selection of those 188 flags. So there's a lot more to learn. And as I say, I will circulate that document so you can do some further reading if you want to. Oh. Yeah, so we're back on Slido now. Hoping you're all still there. We'll move on to the question. So I did mention some of these statements earlier. This is the bit where we really test how much knowledge you've learned from my session, whether I've done it well or not. So non-binary is a spectrum of gender identities that are not exclusively masculine or exclusively feminine. So identities that are outside the gender binary of male and female. True or false? Just give it a few more seconds for the last 4 people to complete. Okay, going to move it on. The answer is true. So well done of those of you that got that correct. Thank you for listening. The next question, what does sexual orientation mean? Is it emotional attraction to other people of same gender, different gender, or multiple genders? Romantic attraction, sexual attraction, all of the above, or none of the above? Give it another few seconds. Looks like we've had a couple of people join us. Okay, I'm going to move it on. So the correct answer was all of the above. And again, well done to those of you that got the answer correct. What does cisgender mean? Gender that does or gender that does not match the gender assigned at birth? Okay, I'm going to move this one on in just a few seconds. If you're not quite there yet, pop your answer in. These are very consistent figures. 92% were correct. So it's gender that matches the gender assigned at birth. What's the term used to describe social and legal, sorry, that should say statuses, and a set of expectations from society about behaviours, characteristics and thoughts? Is it gender, genderqueer or gender fluid? That another 3 seconds. Okay, correct, gender. Hi, you're on the leaderboard. I don't know how your flags impact that, but well done. Obviously not quite the fastest, but definitely got the most right. And as I say, this is just a little bit of fun. So don't take the leaderboard to heart. If you're not on there, I'm sure you've still done a great job. But I just find it always interesting to have the leaderboard so I can see which question people found the hardest, which was how many categories of flag do you think there are? Because that is just a huge number, as I said before. So always a lot to sort of take away from that. So finally, I guess this is just a little bit of time to reflect. Perhaps think about what your take-home messages are, what quick wins you want to take away. So is that adding pronouns to your email signature, as I alluded to earlier, if you haven't already done that? Is it perhaps updating any forms that you use within your team or work to be more inclusive, to include some of those options if you're collecting demographic information? Obviously make sure you are advising of the purpose for collecting that demographic information, but always allow people to have a choice. And if you aren't including the choice that they might select, always include an other option so that people can self-describe. Any thoughts from the group on what's been useful, what you'd like more of, what was the biggest take home for you? Claire.
I think for me, it's something as simple as using someone's name.
Absolutely.
You completely forget that. My daughter is pansexual, and she uses they them, and I will still, at my age, refer to her as her.
Yeah.
And I think it's just something as simple as that, as thinking, don't get yourself confused. Her name's Shannon, even though she doesn't go by the name Shannon, which confuses matters as well. But just something as simple as using a name, because
Absolutely. We do it in email, don't we, all the time, because there's not really any other greeting. So why don't we do that in person when we don't know?
And if you
I
don't
have
know someone, you'd say they or them. If you don't know them, why can't we
Exactly.
do that with someone that
I
we
don't
do
know.
know?
I really don't understand that controversy that I sort of mentioned earlier about people taking real umbrage to a singular person wanting to be referred to as they or them, because that's what we do when we're talking about them in a third person anyway, if we don't know them. So
I
of
have
course you can.
I have the same situation with my son, because he's transgender or fluid. And we went through a phase where he really didn't like me calling him his name, because he was saying I was dead naming him. But I think we've now come to the understanding that when he's at home, we call him by his name because it's just easier for us as kind of older generation, I suppose. Whereas I've got friends of his that I've known since they were babies with him, who I can quite happily call by their what they like to identify as. It's just with him I struggle.
It's that closer connection, isn't it? And
Mm.
obviously it's something that takes time to get used to for most people. Thor's going to come in momentarily, and obviously is going to add their perspective around the lived experience of that shortly. So Thor.
Sorry, just while you're talking about that, obviously as someone who's non-binary, we'll get onto that in a moment. But my parents, while again I'll discuss this in a bit more detail later, but they were really supportive. It was a big change, actually, for my parents, even though they're 110% behind me. And actually, my parents were the people who took the longest to adjust, even though they were arguably the most supportive. And actually, even to this day, I still have conversations, very open conversations with my mum, who's also non-binary, and about when my mum's referring to me when I was a child, they call me she still. Whereas now it's very firmly they, them. So something about as well at that time, kind of still thinking because that's what I was at the time. So it's really interesting you say that actually.
Thanks, Thor.
I think for me it's particularly confusing because he kind of switches between, like I say, because he's fluid rather than it just gets so confusing in my brain. I support him with whatever he decides, obviously, but it's just taking me that longer time to get used to it.
Definitely. Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Claire, for sharing. I think we've got, is it Charles's hand?
Yeah, I just wanted to basically touch on what it sounds like Thor said as well. So as a trans man, the one thing I did notice is that even as I was transitioning and the outside world were referring to me the way that I was wanting to be seen as I was transitioning, my family, my mum particularly, was struggling the most. And I think that is something that even it did take for me to say to her one day when we was in Tesco's, you now look like the crazy one, mum. You know that, right? They're going to cut you off at home at some point. Because my bit, hang on a second, we'll give you some context.
It's an impressive bit.
Mum, that's it, mum. You're starting to like the crazy one. They're going to ship you off to a home eventually. And I said, and she went to me, well, I'll just tell them. And I'll go, well, they won't believe you. So you'll be all right. But no, but as I was taking, like, just rest assured, like, I think for mums, it's different. It's going to take, it does take a little bit more time. One of the things I would like to say is, like, I know that you've said that your child has accepted that at home that you're just going to do whatever name and pronouns. That makes me feel quite uncomfortable because that would make me not want to particularly go home most of the time. If I was having a bad day anyway, and if I was having a bad day with it, that would make me go, what I would like you to be is the person your child turns to when they're in that situation, not the person they can't go to because you're going to add another layer. Do you know what I mean? Because that's the difference. And I'd say that to my granddad at one point. Do you want to be the people I go to or the people I go from? when I'm feeling like that. Because at one point I was talking to them about going over to Poland with £2,000 for chest surgery, which was making them feel quite uncomfortable, or going to Russia for chest surgery, for, you know. So conversations like that you may be left out of, and then you might find out that your child's gone ahead and done something. So that's just what I wanted to chip on that. But I can disappear off into the background now.
No, thank you, Charles. I'm sure it's very helpful for others in the group that don't necessarily have that lived experience themselves, just to try and put things into perspective, because I think as children, we inherently don't want to upset our parents, do we?
No, not at all.
So those children perhaps have come to accept that it's taking longer for parents to move on or what have you, and don't want to say something in that moment, and because they don't want to damage the relationship, it's taken them, presumably, obviously I'm an ally, but
Yeah,
a lot
and I
to
think
come out and be that authentic person in their home environment. So yeah, sorry,
and
Charles, please
I
carry on.
wasn't trying to be harsh with that. All I was trying to say is, like, don't write it off as this is what we've decided at home because we can't do it. Keep it as an ongoing project. Do you know what I mean? It's not a finalised situation, because it can change. It might be that one day you accidentally get it right and think, bloody hell, where did that come from? I did it. Do you know what I mean? And then you never know, it might happen again. And then that becomes more of a natural thing. But I think the thing is the thing with a pronoun is it is the underlying way you see that person that your brain does the automatic thing. And I think no one's going to see you more as the little tiny baby that you were, being told what the genitals were at the time, than your mum. You know, I
Who
get
went
that.
through all that pain and
And
suffering
yeah,
to put
we
you
also
here.
live in a society now where most mums would have known they was having a baby boy or having a baby girl before they even got there. So you were used to having that. You were looking forward to having a son or looking forward to having a daughter from that particular moment. And then it's like, I mean, 26 years later, I've gone, I don't think that's the case. And it's going to take some time, you know? But yeah, keep it as an ongoing project rather than, that's all I wanted to say on that, really, if I'm honest.
Thank you, Charles. And both Claire and Lisa are nodding away in agreement, popping messages in the chat. So I'm sure they haven't taken it as offensively. So thank you. I think that segues us quite nicely into Thor's piece, talking about their experience. So I will hand over. Thank you, Thor.
Thank you very much, Becca. And that presentation was really interesting. I did not get most of those flags right. I have to hold my hands up. So even people within the community, we've all got learning to do.
Absolutely.
So I will just share my screen. Becca, would you mind, just once it comes up, would you just be able to confirm if you can see everything that you should be able to see, just so I know that
Yeah, looks
don't
good.
start
You're on
talking
your,
away.
yeah, you've moved on to your slide 1, lived experience.
Ace, thank you very
you.
much. So, hello everyone. So I'm talking through the sort of lived experience part of this session. Before we get stuck in a little bit, I'm just going to say apologies for being a bit croaky. I'm coming off a bit of a chest infection, so hope you can tolerate a little bit of croakiness in my voice. Apologies. So, bit of an introduction as to who I am. So I think we've already mentioned a little bit of it, but my name is ThorViolet Harman, spelled like that. Yes, very weird. I go by Thor, and I identify as non-binary / gender fluid, and actually / gender queer as well, which isn't something that I included on this, but actually following on from Becca's session, that's genderqueer is probably the word that I identify best with. I generally avoid that in the workplace because, for the same reasons that Becca mentioned, that some people, when I've used it in the past, some people question the use of the queer in it. But any sort of 3 of those words, I suppose, I relate to. Non-binary and genderqueer feel like sort of umbrella terms for my personal experience. And they're sometimes a little bit easy to bulk myself down in the specifics. It would probably be closest to gender fluid. And my pronouns are they, them. Before I move on to the bulk of kind of what I want to talk about, I just want to talk about exactly kind of what being non-binary means to me and how I personally relate to it. So in sort of modern history, gender is often painted as two extremes. So girl or boy, you know, makeup or cars, you know, Barbie or G.I. Joe, right? Whereas actually, I think a lot of people, even cisgender people, so people who identify with the gender that they were assigned at birth, a lot of people don't necessarily feel hyper feminine or hyper masculine, but actually somewhere in between. In other aspects in life, not being at an extreme, but being somewhere more in the middle is seen as quite normal. But when it comes to gender, it's seen as a little bit more unusual still. And I think that's really encapsulates it. A lot of people, both cis and transgender, may feel more moderate in their gender. And some of those people feel that the label of non-binary or genderqueer fits them well. Before I move on, I'd like to make the point as well, for all the allies in the room, that the non-binary fight is a fight for everyone. For both cis and trans people, breaking gender norms is beneficial, which is what the non-binary fight does. You know, it's for cis girls who like to fix cars and cis boys who like to wear makeup, as well as trans people. So these are sort of the 4 areas I'm going to cover today. So first of all, a little bit about my kind of coming out experience, coming out as non-binary, touching on some challenges and triumphs after the fact, a little bit about relationships and community, and then finishing off with a little bit of good practice. Before I do get started as well, I will say if you've got any questions throughout, please put them in the chat. I may not be able to see them, but I will pick them up at the end. So feel free to ask any questions. This is a safe space. Please ask anything, even if you're worried. If you genuinely want clarification, don't worry about using the right words. I'm here to inform. So, coming out as non-binary. To me, coming out as non-binary for the first time and first times represented a bit of a tipping point. So, if you imagine a set of scales, on one side is all the negative feelings of not being out and the feeling inauthentic and feeling uncomfortable in myself. But the other side was the risks that come with being out. So the risk to relationships, the risk to job security, and even personal safety. It came to a point where there's more in the feeling inauthentic side than the risk side, which made me take the jump. In 2016, the scales only had a little bit in the inauthentic side. This was a key year for me because this was the first time that I met other trans people in my personal life. I started, I suppose, noticing things about myself and started trying to put words to the feeling. I'd never been the most conventional of girls, I suppose, when I was a child. So I often got called tomboy, things like that. And I found a profound sense of belonging being around other trans and non-binary people and other people in the wider LGBTQ plus community. However, I did start having some worries about coming out wider. So I was quite worried that people would think it was attention seeking, which I'm sure is a phrase that you've all heard potentially before. I just wanted to be authentic and be true to myself, but I didn't want to be a talking point. I also had concerns that I'd be seen as quite one-dimensional. I've got no wish to be a token character or someone that people want to avoid because I'm seen as difficult. And finally, while I'm proud to do so, it's also quite a lot of pressure representing a whole community when I just want to be who I am. A lot of people don't know endless trans people in their lives. For a lot of people, I was very conscious that I may be the only trans or non-binary person that they knew. And so I did feel quite a lot of pressure. Sorry, just before I continue, I've seen in the chat, I think someone asked how old I was. So I was going to avoid saying this, but so I was born in 2000. So this was when I was 16 or 15, 16-ish. The next point in the timeline was early 2020. So not much, no worries. Not too much happened between then other than a little bit of exploring with fellow trans people in terms of pronouns and things like that. But I didn't come out any further until early 2020. The scales had become more full on the inauthentic side. So I started telling people in my personal life, my friends and family. Interestingly, what really spurred this on was the pandemic. So for all of the obvious difficulties and negatives of lockdown and the pandemic, one of the few benefits of that for me was it gave me separation from the world. It gave me breathing room to exist as I wanted to within my household. It was easier to start navigating my gender identity because I wasn't performing my assigned gender at birth as much. And interestingly, other trans people that I know had a similar experience there. However, with coming out more widely to people who may have been cis, I did begin to face some backlash, which I'll touch on later. Because of that backlash, it was only around late 2021 where I started trying to come out in the workplace. So I was coming to the end of a fixed term role on an apprenticeship, and I thought, well, if it goes badly, I'm leaving. So the consequences felt as minimal as possible. And finally, fast forward to very recently and beyond, now out and proud, now open in all facets of sort of my life. In fact, recently I secured a job at a new trust, and that was the first time that I came out at interview. So I introduced myself with my pronouns, which was a landmark achievement for me. So as you can see from this timeline, it's been a long journey and it's still continuing. Still figuring it all out. It takes a long time. As well, at this point, I'd like to make the point that I'm so much more than being non-binary. It can sometimes be reductive, linking back to that feeling one-dimensional point that I made. It's a poor descriptor for me as a whole, but it does describe a big part of me, if that makes sense. Another point I'd like to make before moving on to the next section is that coming out is a continuous, lifelong process. It's not a binary thing necessarily. You aren't necessarily out or not. It can be that, so for example, I was out to some people and not others at the same time. And every time that there are new people in my life, so a new friend group or a new job, I have to decide whether I'm safe enough to come out all over again. However, while I have had some negative experiences with that, I feel like I've had enough good experiences with it where it's not quite as scary as it once was. So moving on to challenges and triumphs. So this is a little bit of a difficult section. I think the overarching challenge for me, for being non-binary, is the prevailing wind of non-supportive views in society, especially over the past couple of years. It feels like even my rights from the Equalities Act could get eroded any day. My rights and safety feel constantly exposed in a precarious position. This is a quote from Alexander Leon, which I think really resonates with how I feel. Queer people don't grow up as ourselves. We grow up playing a version of ourselves that sacrificed authenticity to minimize humiliation and prejudice. The massive task of our adult lives is to unpick which parts we've created to protect us. I think this encapsulates a lot of my experience really well, actually, which is why I really wanted to include this. It's a big part of why coming out took so long. The performance of gender. So what I mean by that is, I suppose, making choices that aren't me because I felt like I needed to, because society requires me to. So, for example, it's something that I still live with. For example, I have long hair. I still wear makeup sometimes. It's something that I'm trying to work on, but it's it's a massive task of our adult lives. It's not something that's a quick fix. So I'm going to put a couple of things on the screen now. All of these speech bubbles are comments that I have heard openly in NHS offices. In each of these situations, no one disagreed vocally or made any kind of negative comment about these remarks. This was very isolating and really pushed me back steps in terms of coming out. Even if, upon reflection, I'd like to think that a lot of people in those rooms didn't agree with those statements. They may not have felt able to speak up, but it did feel very isolating. Onto a more positive note in terms of triumphs. So one of the key triumphs that I've had, I think, in the last year particularly, was walking in the Manchester Pride Parade. So the trust that I work for, MFT, so Manchester University NHS Foundation Trust, they secured a place in the parade and offered people from the LGBTQ+ staff network to walk in the parade. It was a fantastic opportunity, and I can't put into words how amazing it was and how it will stick with me for the rest of my life, being able to represent two groups incredibly close to my heart, the LGBTQ+ community and the NHS. Another triumph is doing this presentation. As weird as that sounds, this is not something that would have existed 10 years ago. So thank you very much to One NHS Finance for putting this on, of course. And as well, the day-to-day triumphs. So in the workplace, so contributing to ED&I groups and just existing. just existing brings awareness, and that's something that, while is a little bit of a burden, is something that I'm incredibly proud and glad to be able to do. Moving on to relationships and community. So I've been very, very lucky compared to a lot of other people. My close family have, for the most part, been supportive. There are some exceptions, but I've been very lucky to have fantastic support. Friends, I've also not had, well, I've lost some friends along the way. I lost a partner along the way. But I'm now proud, really proud to say that I've gotten to a point where I do not tolerate having people in my life who are not 110% behind me. And that is what I have. And looking back now, I can't believe the things that I used to allow myself to be friends with people who were actively disrespectful to me. So I'm very proud of that. In terms of community, so it's not just the trans and non-binary community specifically, but also the wider LGBTQ plus community. It's really important for me to have that community. So I just want to share this quote from Martha P. Johnson: "No pride for some of us without liberation for all of us." It's very meaningful that the LGBTQ plus community, we all support each other. So, you know, people who have, you know, gay or lesbian or bisexual people support trans people, and trans people support them in turn. It's not just the sub communities, I suppose you could say, supporting themselves. I find it personally very important to have those communities to support, because it means the world to occasionally not be an outlier in the room. It brings a sense of relief and helps give me space to reflect on what day-to-day life is like, the burdens that I don't usually acknowledge day to day, and what it means to carry a difference. As well, how I can do better and how I can be more proactively supportive. For me, community looks like this. So living in Manchester, I moved from my hometown to Manchester pretty much as soon as I was able for this period in my life, because it gives a greater sense of belonging. Yes, it's Canal Street. There is a massive LGBTQ plus community here, and that is, like I say, a great source of support, and I'm very grateful for it. Finally, moving on to a little bit about good practice. So I know that Becca mentioned some elements that I'll cover here. A big reason that I wanted to include this section, just to give a little bit of backing, is when I was asked to do this presentation, I went to sort of cisgender heterosexual colleagues at work and said, I've been asked to do this presentation. If you hadn't have worked with me for the past year and a half, and you maybe hadn't had that experience of working with someone who was non-binary, it was new to you, what would you want to know? And one of the key things that came back actually was how to be an ally proactively, you know, what to do, how do I be a good manager, or how do I be a good colleague? And that's something that never occurred to me, because I just thought it's obvious, but of course it's not obvious. So here's a couple of sorts of tips on ways to be proactive ally. First of all, everyone attending here will either potentially be a member of the LGBTQ plus community or an ally generally accepting and open-minded. A desire to learn and understand is a fantastic first step and is crucially important. However, sometimes you can be unsure on what to action, what can you do, as well as just being open-minded. So first of all, as Becca mentioned earlier, proactively sharing your pronouns if you feel comfortable to do so. If you're questioning your gender, you may not feel as comfortable to do so, and that's absolutely fine. But if comfortable, share them. And crucially as well, pay attention when other people do as well. So that can be when introducing yourself in a meeting, if you're meeting a new team or colleague, or putting it in your email signature can be a really good way of doing it as well, and looking at other people's email signatures. This really helps to kind of embed a kind of natural environment of respect and awareness. If allies do it too, even if their pronouns align with the gender that they were assigned at birth, then it normalizes it. And when a transgender or non-binary person does it, it doesn't make it stand out so much. It's not as much of a marker. Next, try not to make assumptions about gender identity. So non-binary experiences aren't universal. Not everyone has the same one. And gender expression doesn't always match gender identity. Exhibit A. Also trying to avoid gendered language for the same reason. If you're referring to a group of people that you don't know, because it's really easy to accidentally misgender someone that way. So for example, saying ladies or guys, it can be totally innocuous, but you can end up misgendering someone that way. Next, acknowledge mistakes. Keep trying and don't get frustrated with yourself or the person. Non-binary people, well, I don't like speaking for all non-binary people or trans people because it's absolutely not my place to do so. And as I've said numerous times throughout this presentation, this is my experience and I can only speak for myself. Excuse me. But I think it's fair to say that non-binary people don't mind when people make mistakes. It will happen and it is completely understandable, especially with pronouns, because pronouns are an inherent part of speech that are a subconscious part of speech, and changing the way that you think and the way that you see it can take a bit of time, particularly if you've known someone for a long time, as we touched on earlier, because it almost can sometimes be more of a force of habit than what you see them as. But it's really important to keep trying. It's hurtful when people kind of stop trying or don't try. Reviewing documents and processes. So this, again, I think Becca touched on earlier, I could have done a whole presentation on this. I mean, this can be very wide, but I'll just give a couple of examples. So, for example, new starter forms. Sorry, like I say, sore throat, apologies. For example, new starter forms or anything like that. If there is a gender option, having, like Becca said, maybe an other option for people to free type, or in policy documents, often I see he/she. You can just change that to they, because they is all encompassing of it can be any. Something that people sometimes don't think about is honorifics. So Miss, Mr, Ms. At very least include MX. But it's also worth considering if an honorific is really needed. For example, someone I know, the NHS trust that they work at, their AP system requires that when they send out an invoice, if it's just to like an individual, they have to have an honorific. Is it really needed? It's very easy to misgender someone that way, again, linking back to the second point. Next, politely correcting other colleagues. So linking back to earlier, politely correcting other people's mistakes, but also actively commenting on what isn't a mistake and is kind of unacceptable language. It takes the burden off the individual and it helps them feel supported. If I had had even one person in some of those scenarios that I mentioned earlier where people have made comments, if even one person had said something or even taken me to the side later and said, I don't think that was right, that would have made the world a difference. And finally, appropriate facilities. So fully appreciate sort of practical estates restrictions on these, but where possible, be aware of the locations of gender neutral toilets, changing rooms, shower facilities, anything that you may have like that. If you don't have any, but there are gendered sort of the single stall facilities, the ones with just one sort of toilet, sink, etc. in, consider suggesting that these be made gender neutral could be useful too. Fundamentally, I think the key thing that you can do is just ask. So non-binary people are not the third gender. Everyone is individual. We're not a monolith. Ask if you're not sure. I will say certain questions, just for the avoidance of doubt, certain questions, such as questions on medical status, are not always appropriate in the workplace, or generally, to be honest, but likewise, you wouldn't ask a cisgender person about their medical status in that regard. But beyond that, ask. If you're not sure if someone's out wider at work, ask them. No one's going to be offended. And actually, well, in my view at least, it shows a willingness to learn again, and that makes people feel supported. In terms of advice for if you're questioning, I think things like this, so listening to people with lived experiences is vital. Trying to online resources, of which I've got a couple of links at the end of this, which will obviously when the slides go out, you can have a read. If you know any sort of trans or non-binary people, talking to them, all of those things can be good if you're questioning and just thinking about words, do they fit your experience? But equally, you don't have to have the words. You don't need labels if you don't want. Labels are only useful if you find them useful. So that's everything, I think. Thank you very much for listening. Are there any questions? I think I've seen things going off in the chat, but